But anyway, look, my name is Constant Hughes, and I'm part of this network, this religious studies network at Monash with Aidoan and Ashkan, and we're been looking at this whole issue of the journey of the soul. So today it's my very great pleasure to introduce Dr. Jessica Wolfe. She's Marcel Bataillon Professor of English and Comparative Literature at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill in the United States, from where she's speaking at the moment. Her main field of expertise is Renaissance culture, and she writes about a wide range of topics from natural philosophy to occult sciences to the reception of classical literature to comparative epic and comedy, some things which I myself am really very interested in. But her two major monographs have big questions in their titles. Homer and the Question of Strife, from Erasmus to Hobbes. It's Toronto 2015. And Humanism, Machinery and Renaissance Literature, Cambridge 2004. So today, Jessica will discuss one of her favorite themes in Renaissance literature, metempsychosis. Her talk is titled Reincarnation in Renaissance Literature. So over to you, Jessica.
Thanks very much for the introduction. I should preface this by saying that this talk is a little more casual and improvised than I would do if I were in person, because I wanted a more animated voice while I'm talking to you today, and not to be reading from a script while you have to, listen on Zoom. And some of this work is based on an article I published 3 or 4 years ago in Huntington Library Quarterly that focuses on the English writer and physician and polymath Thomas Browne. So we'll be looking very closely at some of Browne's passages where he discusses metempsychosis. And, Browne is much beloved in my field of English Renaissance literature, but not very well known outside of it. So I thought that some of this material could be quite useful for scholars who are interested in metempsychosis, either from a religious or a kind of classical background context, who may not know what Browne has to say about metempsychosis, or as he often calls it, transmigration and transmigration of the soul. I wanted to begin just by giving us an overview of the major texts and intellectual traditions from which Renaissance writers are gaining their knowledge of metempsychosis. And this list is very European, right? It's rooted in classical Greek and Latin literature. But in fact, a lot of the interest that writers of the 15th and 16th and 17th centuries had in metempsychosis was through a kind of a comparative cultural studies. They were fascinated with the fact that the Zoroastrians, the Persians, even for the English, the Druids, believed in some form of metempsychosis. And I think this is one of the several doctrines that for learned Renaissance writers provided a kind of link amongst ancient cultures. And for those of you who are not medieval or Renaissance scholars, it's important to know that there was a really strong preoccupation in this period with trying to link up Hebraic and classical pagan culture, the idea that Noah and Homer, or Moses and Homer, were alive at the same time, the idea that various floods are being described are actually one and the same flood. So I think that metempsychosis, in addition to its other attractions, which I'll talk about in a few minutes, one of the attractions that it held for a lot of Renaissance writers was that it offered a path, even if a kind of murky path, back towards a kind of pristine theology, to the idea that there was one unified theology in utter antiquity that was shared by everyone, and that is what needs to be excavated by the learned editors and translators of classical texts. It's also worth noting that a lot of the works that describe or systematize doctrines of metempsychosis in this period are spurious or forged. So you have a lot of writers who are working with materials that are, during this very period, being discovered as forgeries, most famously Hermes Trismegistus, but also the Chaldean Zoroaster, writings ascribed to Zoroaster, but seem to postdate him by many centuries, also writings ascribed to Orpheus, and which, if you studied that body of writings, you can know how problematic the Orphic canon are. And so at the same time that some of these writers are devouring the Hermetic and Orphic writings that outline theories of metempsychosis, you have other writers who are far more skeptical and are trying to debunk, often through philological means and through textual evidence, the legitimacy of these writings themselves. And as we'll see, what that results in sometimes is a lot of mockery of the idea of metempsychosis. It kind of stands in for some of these learned writers who are more skeptical as a doctrine that those who are, I don't know, a little less skeptical fall for or believe in. And so at the end of my list, I put the satirical accounts of Pythagorean metempsychosis by Lucian, among others, the Greek satirist Lucian, because I think those were incredibly influential on the more jocular, playful, and satirical treatments of metempsychosis in this period. And in fact, if you survey, at least in English Renaissance literature, if you survey all the examples or the instances of discussions of metempsychosis across literature, both imaginative literature and also more learned writings, I would say that it roughly half involves some kind of satire or mockery. So metempsychosis could be a tool by which to mock other doctrines, and we'll see a little glimpse of that in a few moments. I'd be glad in the Q&A to come back and talk about any of these texts, and I mean, they have very, very different treatments of metempsychosis, obviously, but I'm not going to really get into that for today. Let's see. For some reason, I can't advance here. Let's see. Excuse me, my advance button was not working, but I have another one. So I thought it might be useful to talk about three distinct revivals of metempsychosis during the European Renaissance. These are all taking place simultaneously, so this is not a chronological list, but rather I'm trying to separate out three different strains of interest in the doctrine. The first and the most serious from a scholarly perspective is the Platonic Pythagorean revival. This principally involves, at least at its beginnings in the 1470s and 1480s, the figure of Marsilio Ficino, who was the great expositor of the works of Plato and wrote original works of Platonic theology, but also translated and edited many of Plato's dialogues. From there, we can look within the circle of Lorenzo de' Medici in Florence to the figure of Giovanni Pico della Mirandola, and then later in the 16th century to a number of natural philosophers, including Bruno, Copernicus, and Kepler, who were very interested in metempsychosis for precisely the reasons I was discussing earlier, as a pathway to a pristine theology, to an originary theology that unites all the disparate theological stances that exist during the Renaissance itself. The second, which sort of comes a little later, and you can probably imagine, given the names of Copernicus and Kepler, the transition from the first to the second, is what Kevin Killeen, who's my collaborator on an edition of Thomas Brown, a very good scholar of 17th century theology and science, is the science of the soul, this enormous outpouring of interest in metaphysics and ontology in the late 16th into the early to mid 17th century, that revolves often around questions of metamorphosis in the natural world, and we're going to see some examples of that later today, but also in questions of ontology and personhood. And just for the sake of shorthand in this short talk, I would say that a lot of these questions are ship of Theseus questions about sort of how much of a body needs to change and in what manner before that body no longer remains the same. And those are questions that for Renaissance writers in a European Christian tradition have absolutely central ramifications for the resurrection as well, sort of the ultimate change of body that takes place at the resurrection. But they also have much more earthy ramifications in terms of understanding what happens when a caterpillar transforms into a butterfly. And that sort of, that often is the prime example. Then you have a more literary set of stakes or set of interests in metempsychosis, and that is because of the chief writers in the Latin tradition. We have Virgil, Lucretius, and Ovid, obviously not in that order, all addressing the doctrine of metempsychosis in different ways. And so we find writers, particularly in the epic tradition in England and Europe during the Renaissance, wanting to create their own doctrine of metempsychosis to answer Virgil, to answer Ovid in Book 15 of the Metamorphoses, and to answer some of Lucretius's more skeptical treatment of metempsychosis in the De Rerum Natura, in his Of the Nature of Things. There's another way in which metempsychosis functions in a very important way in the literary tradition. And that is because it's a way for writers to narrate their own literary genealogy or their own inheritance. And this goes all the way back to the supposed account of Ennius kind of receiving the soul of Homer. That is the locus classicus for many, many other accounts of a soul of an ancient poet passing into the soul of a modern poet. The most absurd is actually a writer I've worked on a great deal, and that's George Chapman, who was the first English well, actually, technically he wasn't, but he's known as the first English translator of Homer. And he recounts how he's sitting on a hill in his hometown of Hitchin in Hertfordshire, England, and the soul of Homer, passes into him. And it's worth thinking about these occasions, these narratives of a metempsychotic sort of habitation of one poet by another as narratives that I think were recognized to be false or fabricated and artificial. I don't think that Chapman per se necessarily believed in the doctrine of metempsychosis, but he found it a useful fiction to think with when he carves out his own genealogy going back to Homer rather than, as would be the case for many English poets of the time, to Virgil or to Ovid or to someone sort of a little more mainstream. And we'll see a very weird example of this with Thomas Browne a little later in my talk. There were some real challenges to believing in metempsychosis during the Renaissance. Some of these I'm sure will be familiar to you. The most obvious, perhaps, is that it contradicts the Christian doctrine of the resurrection of the flesh, or rather, I should say, all the Christian doctrines of the resurrection of the flesh, because after the Reformation, we have many different opinions on how that process actually takes place. Metempsychosis is also a problem for natural philosophers and physicians and others who want to believe that nature is quite varied rather than monolithic or finite. That to believe in metempsychosis for a writer like Browne or many of his contemporaries means that you have to believe that there's a kind of a finite number of souls that keeps getting recycled. And Browne points out a really interesting problem when he's discussing this that we'll look at in a few moments. But but the idea is that the book of nature is written by God, and that its beauty resides largely in its variety, in having many, many different species. And if you see finite souls being recycled as they turn from a snake to a cow to a human and back again, that suggests a kind of diminishment of that anxiety. Then there's the problem related to this, that the number of souls for someone who endorses the doctrine of metempsychosis is believed to be finite or limited. And this was a problem sort of analogous to the problem posed by the doctrine of preformation in this period, that that there's a limited number of beings, at least, or souls of beings, and there can't be any more. And in fact, where this gets really interesting, and I won't be talking about this today, but I think you've heard another talk about it a few months back, is when extinction and the appearance of new species starts to be recognized in the 18th and 19th centuries, because that's when these ideas that we have a kind of recycling of species really gets challenged by the record of natural fact. Then lastly, the strong conviction that whatever metempsychosis was to Pythagoras, or whatever it was to Orpheus, has been corrupted or perverted over many centuries or millennia of the textual record. One version of this that we'll hear from Browne is that metempsychosis was intended to be a metaphorical idea, right? It was a figuration or a pretty fiction, and that it's now being interpreted during the Renaissance too literally by some writers, that it was really seen as a fable. And of course, Plato, even though he banishes poets from his Republic, loves to teach in fable. So this is an example of a kind of pre-Platonic or Pythagorean fable about natural philosophy that then gets rigidified. It gets, interpreted too literally by later writers. And this was a common idea about myth more generally. So, a myth about Hephaestus being about volcanoes might be, something similar to believing that metempsychosis began as a figuration and became more and more literal over time. So a lot of the writers who address this problem are writers who are trying to recuperate myth by putting it at a figurative distance from natural fact. And yet, what we find is that Renaissance writers are nonetheless attracted to metempsychosis for so many different reasons. And so I thought it would be worth outlining these before moving to some specific examples of discussions of metempsychosis. First, metempsychosis could be seen as a species of ancient wisdom if it's understood correctly, right? I mean, this fascination during the Renaissance with pristine theology and with ancient wisdom, I think draws a lot of writers to want to read the textual record of, testimonials of Pythagorean writings, Orphic writings, and also Plato and some of the Latin poets I mentioned earlier. It's a doctrine, again, as I mentioned earlier, that demonstrates an affinity, a religious or theological affinity between and among different ancient cultures. There's no comparative anthropology or comparative religion as a discipline of study in the Renaissance, but there is an appreciation that the Zoroastrians, the Persians, the Greeks and the Romans, and even the Druids for the English, might have arrived at very similar theological doctrines about the reincarnation of the soul. It's a doctrine that, especially from the scientific vantage point, promised to explain certain things about metamorphosis in created nature, and also promised, perhaps, at least for some, to help explain the ultimate transformation involved in the resurrection. So again, even if one does not endorse a belief in metempsychosis, one can use it to think with, right? And use it to think about how we understand different species of metamorphosis in created nature. It's a doctrine that could be used to explain syncresis or recurrence of people, of ideas, of historical patterns, right? I mean, everyone in the Renaissance agreed that history was somewhat circular, even if it was also somewhat linear. And metempsychosis, I think, is a very attractive doctrine for explaining why things sort of seem to go away and come back again, right? Why people might resemble long dead people, why historical patterns might recur, or, as we'll see in the case of Brown, why ideas recur after many years of going underground. And lastly, it's a doctrine that could provide some scaffolding to a doctrine that was much debated in the Renaissance, a doctrine of thanatopsychism or soul sleep. And this is the idea that, the soul, doesn't kind of like catapult straight to its resurrection. It goes to sleep for a long time and then kind of wakes up later. And I mean, oddly, metempsychosis and soul sleep are at odds with each other in some very basic ways, but one often finds discussions of the two taking place together. And metempsychosis could also provide scaffolding to the theory of correspondences in the Renaissance, the related group of ideas that there's an affinity or even a sympathy across different living creatures, right? And that shows up in a lot of different varieties, perhaps best known through the Paracelsian doctrine of signatures, the idea that there are antipathies and sympathies between and among various creatures. And of course, if you believe that souls are reincarnated in the bodies of different kinds of animals and plants, it's helpful in believing in this theory of correspondences and signatures. Now I'm going to turn to three examples from writings outside of the world of Thomas Brown. All of these are fairly well known if you're well versed in discussions of metempsychosis in the Renaissance. I apologize that this is probably not unfamiliar to you. But one of my favorite scenes from Book 4 of Edmund Spenser's Faerie Queene, I think, is a great way of showing how a writer who would be deeply troubled with the idea of metempsychosis in classical literature somehow manages to Christianize it to make it palatable for himself. So this is a dynastic Protestant epic where Spenser wants his moment of metempsychosis, and in fact there are several in the text. There's another one in Book 3. But he wants to sanitize it by making it congenial to Christian doctrine as he understands it. So this scene concerns a woman, Agape, who has 3 sons, and she doesn't want any of her sons to die in battle. So she allows this single soul that sort of unites the 3 sons to pass from one to the next as each one dies in battle. So it's not a very sort of kosher, normal version of metempsychosis, but I think that that's exactly what Spencer is thinking about, looking back to Virgil and Ovid especially. And so the fairy whom Agape asks, to effect this sharing of souls, is very strict about how, the term of each man's life is limited, kind of central to Spencer's Protestant doctrine that you don't want to prolong life, nor do you want to cut it short through self-murder or suicide. And yet she nonetheless grants, and I'm just going to read a few lines here, that when ye shred with fatal knife his line, which is the eldest of the three, which is of them the shortest, as I see, eftsoons his life may pass into the next, and when the next shall likewise ended be, that both their lives may likewise be annexed unto the third, that his may so be trebly waxed. So to boil it down to plain English, the soul of each dead brother passes to the next and to the next. And I think it's significant here that Spencer is thinking about brotherhood. He's thinking about a kind of camaraderie that is very intimate, even as he's also thinking about the resurrection at the same time. So he's sort of embedding his Christian values of fellowship, brotherhood, and also sharing, really, sort of generosity, right? Because each son has to give up his own soul to pass it to the next one. And then it's no surprise that the woman who orchestrates this entire process is named agape, the highest and most Christian, most self-sacrificing kind of love, higher than just the philia of brotherhood or the friendship of brotherhood. So for Spencer, he takes a doctrine which might seem on the surface deeply hostile to his Protestant theology, and as Spencer always, manages to do in sort of classical scenes of his epic poem, manages to embed it so that it works with that Protestant theology. And in fact, the entire scene as it plays out is a celebration of the kind of brotherhood or fellowship between men, between brothers, but also by the end of the scene, between men who are not brothers, but become brothers through marriage. Our next example is from Christopher Marlowe's play, Dr. Faustus. So I'm moving kind of roughly in chronological order, where my first two examples are from the 1590s. And there's this amazing moment at the very end of Marlowe's play where Dr. Faustus pretty much knows that he is damned, that he is heading to hell kind of within the hour. This is the last hour of his life and the long speech that takes place. And he's wishing that Pythagoras' metempsychosis were true, that this soul should fly from me and I be changed into some brutish beast. All beasts are happy, for when they die, their souls are soon dissolved in elements, but mine must live still to be plagued in hell. Now, Faustus is parroting a couple of different ideas that are current, but also somewhat heretical in this time period. One is the idea that only humans, because only humans have an immortal soul, are consigned to damnation. Animals, plants, aren't damned. They just die, right? They have mortal souls as well as bodies. But when Marlowe's Faustus wishes that, that Pythagoras' metempsychosis were true, he also gets the doctrine wrong. And if you note what he does, the first part is right, where he says, I wish I could just be changed into an animal rather than die. Well, that's good enough as an example of how metempsychosis works. But then he says, all beasts are happy, for when they die, their souls are soon dissolved in elements. Well, that's not what happens with metempsychosis. That's precisely, what doesn't happen is that you don't just get dissolved into the soil. And it's one moment among many in this play where Faustus is deeply attracted to a theological or philosophical doctrine that is provocative or controversial or heretical, that he misunderstands. And I think Marlowe understands full well what is being misunderstood here. And of course, Faustus is desperate in this moment. He's, wishing for anything except the fate that seems to await him. So he's wishing to be transformed into a beast. He's wishing to be dissolved into elements, anything but hell, right? And he's coming to terms in this scene with the fact that he's, condemned to eternal damnation. But I think Marlowe, and I don't have time to lay this out with more detail, but I mean, I think Marlowe is offering us up metempsychosis as a more palatable alternative to Christian damnation, in a play that shows us how believing in damnation necessarily theologically or spiritually productive. Um, and and again, I'm happy to come back to that idea later, but this is borne out by the way a lot of Renaissance writers tend to read Virgil, Aeneid 6, tend to read even Ovid's last book of the Metamorphoses as another doctrine taken from classical antiquity rather than from the Renaissance, that holds out the promise of reward and punishment, but in a way that is not so horrible, right? Not quite as horrible as eternal damnation, where there's an underlying justice and sense of retribution or distributive justice, at the same time that, you have another chance, right? You can come back as a snake or a cow and maybe do better next time. So I think, even though Faustus misunderstands the doctrine and sort of gets it wrong, there's a seriousness with which Marlowe is treating the doctrine of metempsychosis here as a more palatable alternative to eternal damnation. The third, and I'm going to touch on this just very briefly, is a poem that, I mean, anyone who's worked on metempsychosis in the Renaissance, I think, has puzzled over. And that's a poem by John Donne that's called The Progress of the Soul, published in 1612. And it's a poem that narrates the metempsychosis of a soul from one beast, one animal, or plant, actually plants and animals, to another. But almost nobody thinks that Donne took the doctrine seriously. So one of the things that we see Donne doing, and this will matter when we get to Brown, is celebrating the variety of nature through this narrative of metempsychotic change or metamorphosis. In the first lines here, you can see that swimming college and free hospital of all mankind, that cage and vivary of fowls and beasts, in whose womb destiny and us and our latest nephews did install, et cetera, et cetera. And then he, describes how this is going to fill this all. He's describing a kind of Noah's Ark of different animals. Even though metempsychosis is often seen as a threat to this divinely appointed variety. And I think that Donne's poem was very influential on later treatments of metempsychosis that are satirical or jocular, a doctrine that is possible to be played around with without necessarily endorsing in a wholehearted or serious manner. So with this, I wanted to get to Thomas Brown, and I realize we don't have a huge amount of time left, but I'll try in the next 10 minutes or so to outline how Brown thought about metempsychosis. His most definitive statement about metempsychosis is in a work called the Religio Medici. It's a kind of confession, autobiography, work of lay theology from the 1640s. And he writes there, I cannot believe the wisdom of Pythagoras did ever positively and in a literal sense affirm his metempsychosis or impossible transmigration of the souls of men into beasts. Okay, well, that seems clear enough, right? But then you look, same chapter, same section of Religio Medici, what does he say about Lot's wife from the Old Testament? Of all metamorphoses or transmigrations, I believe only one, that is of Lot's wife. Oops, we have a problem here. And that's why I went and published an article sort of on this problem, because Brown says, I do believe in one metempsychosis. It just happens to be miraculous and biblical rather than one that we can all hope to partake in. So his views are very conflicted. And I think that's in part because he sees evidence of something like metempsychosis taking place all around him as a naturalist and a physician. And he was both of those things. But also because I think he's deeply attracted to the idea, even though he's not quite willing to allow for the literal truth of it. So we see him over and over again conceding to the idea that metempsychosis is true in a figurative or metaphorical sense, and it may be very, very occasionally true in a more literal sense, i.e. Lot's wife turning into a pillar of salt. So in the work that I've been editing for 10 years now, a big encyclopedic work called the Pseudodoxia Epidemica by Brown, Brown tells us more that can shed light on why he seems attracted to this doctrine, but nervous about endorsing it. Literally, he writes, by this way, many errors crept in and perverted the doctrine of Pythagoras, whilst men received his precepts in a different sense from his intention, converting metaphors into proprieties and receiving as literal expressions obscure and involved truths. So there, and this is in a chapter that deals with how errors arise in the world of intellectual history. That's really what the Pseudodoxia Epidemica is devoted to, as an encyclopedia of errors and falsehoods. And he uses Pythagorean metempsychosis as a kind of master example of how something that was meant metaphorically at first becomes literal over time, and thus becomes filled with error. And here we have, from another section of the Pseudodoxia on the right-hand side of the slide, kind of another contradictory passage where Brown is insisting yet again that the metamorphosis of Lot's wife is a true and literal metempsychosis, not a metaphorical one. So he's willing to backtrack a lot. And I think one of the things that people either love or hate about Thomas Brown is that he's full of contradictions. He's constantly revising his own ideas. He's in some ways the English 17th century answer to Michel de Montaigne, the French essayist, in that way. And so this is where I'm probably gonna end today. The very final chapter of Brown's Pseudodoxia Epidemica. So he publishes this 600-page work that's errors about everything have arisen. Do they arise because of a textual error? Do they arise because someone voices an untrue opinion and that opinion sticks? And these are errors about plants and animals, errors about religion, geography, you name it. The final chapter of the 7th book kind of flips the equation and discusses doctrines and ideas that might be true, but if true, are rather terrifying to contemplate. And this is how the work ends. Okay, so this is where Brown decides to end this magisterial encyclopedia. And if the transanimation, and by that Brown means, the reincarnation of the soul, and if the transanimation of Pythagoras or method thereof were true, that the souls of men transmigrated into species answering their former natures, some men must surely live over many serpents. And though the objection of Plato should take place that bodies subjected unto corruption must fail at last before the period of all things, and growing fewer in number, must leave some souls apart unto themselves, the spirits of many long before that time will find but naked habitations, and meeting no assimilables, and this is Brown's traditionally difficult prose, meeting no assimilables wherein to react their natures, must certainly anticipate such natural desolations. So what Brown is describing here is what happens if, you've got bodies without soul, or you've got souls without bodies, right? And they're looking for new bodies to inhabit. But what happens if they don't find new bodies to inhabit? What happens if there's a mismatch between the number of bodies that need to be repopulated with souls and the number of souls who are out there, almost like musical chairs, looking for a place to rest? And I think Brown is using this in part on a meditation, as a meditation on human uniqueness, ending with that word desolations, which, Latin desolus, it means kind of utterly alone, bereft of all company, suggests that there's something, painful or melancholy about the idea of a soul who is looking for a new home, but cannot find it because that soul doesn't match, right? It doesn't find its assimilable, or the thing to which it can connect. And Brown often insisted on a certain level of human uniqueness. He writes a lot about faces and how faces are all different from each other. He was fascinated by the variety, the sort of dizzying variety of different individuals, whether in the human world or in the animal world. And I think that his close observation of nature sort of helps him to contemplate this idea that that souls might be looking for new bodies, but not finding enough similarity to be able to lodge themselves there. He's also, unpacking here this question of the finitude of souls, which was a big sticking point for so many Renaissance natural philosophers and others who were interested but also a little disturbed by metempsychosis. And I think he's also meditating on the limited moral power of metempsychosis here when he says some men must surely live over many serpents. I mean, I think he's suggesting here that some people are so bad they're going to be stuck as a snake. They're not going to advance upwards in the scale of nature, which is always how metempsychosis in classical texts is represented, right? That, you get punished by being downgraded to a bug, but then hopefully you will rise up once again. So it's, a marvelous passage, I think, that really captures so much of Brown's thinking about metempsychosis. And obviously he's not endorsing the doctrine as true. He is entertaining the possibility of its truth in order to proceed further in his investigation. So I'm going to end there, just because I know I've been at talk for 35 minutes or so, and I've had my 35 minutes, but I'm glad to, I have some more slides that I'm happy to share with folks individually, or if something comes up in the Q&A, I can always rush and find one.